Have you ever inherited something you wished you hadn't? What if that heirloom didn't just tell time, it controlled it? Dive into the chilling tale of Daniel Keller, a struggling writer whose life takes a dark turn after receiving a sinister clock that holds the power of time and the weight of an ancient curse.
Daniel Keller didn't consider himself a sentimental person, especially not about family. Estranged from most of his relatives for years, he was shocked when he received a letter informing him that his eccentric great-uncle, Matthias Grieve, had passed away and left something specifically for him in his will. The letter didn't offer many details, only that Daniel was to retrieve an item from Matthias's crumbling estate. It was an odd request. Daniel had met Matthias only once as a child. That encounter was fleeting, but he remembered the old man's piercing eyes and the unnerving collection of clocks that ticked relentlessly in his dimly lit house. When Daniel arrived at the mansion, the years of neglect were evident. The roof sagged, ivy clawed at the stone walls, and the windows were murky with grime. The estate's caretaker, a wiry, hollow-eyed man named Mr. Crawley, greeted Daniel with a tight-lipped smile. "It's in the study," Mr. Crawley muttered, leading Daniel through the decaying labyrinth of hallways. The air inside the house was heavy, carrying a strange metallic tang. When they reached the study, Daniel's eyes fell on the item in question, a towering grandfather clock. Its dark wood was carved with grotesque figures, faces twisted in agony, hands clawing at invisible barriers. It was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen, and he felt a strange pull toward it, as though the clock were watching him. "This is your inheritance," Mr. Crawley said, his voice wavering. "Your uncle was very specific. The clock belongs to you now. It cannot stay here." Despite the unease twisting in his gut, Daniel agreed to take the clock. It was an odd heirloom, but he wasn't in a position to refuse. His freelance writing gigs were barely paying the rent, and something about the clock seemed worth investigating. Perhaps it would inspire a new story. Back in his cramped apartment, Daniel set up the clock in the corner of his living room. It loomed over the space, dominating the room with its oppressive presence. The carvings seemed to shift in the dim light, their shadows contorting into eerie shapes. When he wound the clock, a faint chime echoed through the apartment, sharp and discordant. The ticking that followed was not like a normal clock's steady rhythm. It was erratic, almost organic, as if the clock were breathing. At first, Daniel dismissed his unease as overactive imagination. He was a writer, after all, prone to seeing stories in mundane things. But the strange occurrences started almost immediately. The first night, Daniel woke to the sound of whispers. He sat up in bed, heart pounding, but the apartment was silent. The next day, he noticed his cat, Luna, behaving oddly. She refused to enter the living room, her ears flattened and her gaze fixed on the clock. The ticking began to invade his thoughts. It followed him everywhere, growing louder and more insistent. The clock's hands seemed to move on their own, stopping at inexplicable times. Once, they froze at 11:47, and Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of dread, though he couldn't explain why. Daniel's writing began to suffer. He couldn't focus, his sentences disjointed, his characters lifeless. Time felt distorted. Mornings dragged endlessly, while afternoons disappeared in a blink. The clock seemed to dictate the flow of his days, and Daniel was powerless to resist. One evening, as he sat staring at the blank page on his laptop, he glanced at the clock. Its hands were spinning wildly, faster than he thought possible, but the ticking remained steady. He rubbed his eyes, certain he was imagining things. But when he looked again, the hands had stopped abruptly, at 3:15. At that moment, the temperature in the room dropped. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, crawling up the walls like living things. Luna let out a guttural hiss and darted under the couch. Daniel tried to approach the clock, but his legs felt like lead. The room seemed to warp around him, the air vibrating with an unseen energy. He heard faint voices, whispers that grew louder and more distinct as he drew closer to the clock. "Daniel," the voices called, soft and mournful. He stumbled backward, his pulse racing. The whispers stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. Determined to understand the clock's strange behavior, Daniel dove into research about his uncle Matthias. The man had been a renowned clockmaker in his youth, celebrated for his intricate designs and innovative mechanisms. But as Daniel uncovered more, the stories turned darker. Old newspaper clippings hinted at Matthias's descent into madness. Neighbors spoke of strange lights and sounds coming from his home late at night. One article mentioned a mysterious disappearance. Matthias's assistant, a young woman named Clara, had vanished without a trace. Daniel found a journal among the clock's hidden compartments, its pages filled with Matthias's scrawled notes. The entries detailed his obsession with manipulating time, his belief that it was a force that could be controlled and bent to his will. "I have created a masterpiece," one entry read. "A clock that does not merely measure time, but commands it. Yet it comes at a cost. The clock demands a price, a sacrifice. Time is no longer my ally, but my captor." The final pages were incoherent, filled with frantic scribbles and desperate pleas. "Do not let it stop. The clock must always tick. If it stops, it will take everything." The more time Daniel spent near the clock, the more its influence grew. His dreams were filled with visions of Matthias, his face gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken with despair. He saw glimpses of other people, too. Figures trapped within the clock's carvings, their mouths open in silent screams. Daniel tried to move the clock out of his apartment, but every time he touched it, a searing pain shot through his hand. The clock seemed to root itself in place, defying any attempt to remove it. The whispers returned, more insistent now. They told Daniel of others who had been claimed by the clock, souls trapped in its relentless cycle. He realized with growing horror that the clock was not just a machine, it was a prison, and Matthias had been its first victim. One night, the whispers grew deafening, drowning out all other sounds. Daniel collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as the clock's hands spun wildly. The air around him grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to close in, suffocating him. A figure emerged from the darkness, Matthias. He looked more ghost than man, his body translucent, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You must destroy it," Matthias whispered. "But the clock does not die easily. To break the curse, you must sacrifice yourself." Daniel recoiled. "Why me? I didn't ask for this." Matthias's expression twisted with regret. "It chose you, as it chose me. You can end this, Daniel, but only if you're willing to pay the price." Daniel knew what he had to do. Armed with a sledgehammer, he prepared to destroy the clock. The room trembled as he raised the hammer, the clock's ticking growing louder and more frantic. The faces carved into its surface seemed to writhe, their silent screams pleading with him to stop. With a guttural cry, Daniel brought the hammer down. The clock shattered, its gears and wood splintering apart in an explosion of sound and light. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the whispers faded, the shadows retreated, and the oppressive weight lifted from the room. But Daniel's relief was short-lived. As he turned to leave, he noticed the clock's remnants beginning to reassemble themselves. He felt an icy grip on his chest and realized the truth. He had freed the others, but the curse was now his. The clock stood whole once more, its hands ticking steadily. Daniel's reflection stared back at him from the glass face, trapped inside, forever a part of the clock's eternal prison.
Time waits for no one, but sometimes it takes everything. If Daniel's haunting fate gave you goosebumps, make sure to let us know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to Storytime for more gripping tales of mystery, horror, and suspense. And hey, watch out for the ticking clocks in your life. See you in the next story.